hellish revenge for Kyiv. This has never happened before. It seems Putin will have to redraw the map of a safe Russia. Where the Kremlin once felt untouchable, it suddenly got very hot. And it seems that distance no longer works as protection. And while in Moscow they're putting out not only fires but also their own hysteria, new bad news for the Kremlin is coming from the front. It seems that a series of surprises is beginning for Putin, ones he definitely didn't order. And it gets even more interesting. Could it be that Trump is whispering important intelligence to Zelensky? This is why Russia has fallen and we know exactly where to strike. Russia is collapsing under tremendous pressure. We'll talk about this right now. Greetings, this is Ukraine. Today, I am Maria Farafonova and here are the latest events. It seems that for Russia, there is nothing left anymore. The concept of a deep rear, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces struck a target that Moscow considered unreachable. The Omsk oil refinery, almost 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, suddenly found itself at the center of a massive fire. And this is no longer just another attack on Russian oil infrastructure. This is a signal that even the most distant industrial giants of the Russian Federation can no longer feel safe. The most painful detail for the Kremlin is that it wasn't just any plant that was hit, but the true heart of Russia's fuel machine. The Omsk oil refinery is the largest oil processing enterprise in the country, annually refining over 21 million tons of oil and supplying the production of gasoline, diesel fuel, and aviation gas. It is precisely the products of this enterprise that help sustain the operation of Russia's military machine. And now, another very unpleasant fire has been added to Moscow's list of strategic problems. The Omsk plant was also the last of the 11 largest automotive fuel producers in Russia that had not yet suffered Ukrainian strikes. In other words, Ukraine has effectively closed another chapter of this campaign. For years, the Russian authorities have insisted that the giant industrial facilities in Siberia are outside the danger zone. Now, this illusion is crumbling just as quickly as the Kremlin's latest statements about having the situation fully under control. And this is where the real nightmare begins for Moscow. According to experts, the Omsk oil refinery holds an almost monopolistic position for the entire Russian oil refining industry. It is here that a critically important component is produced, without which full-scale secondary oil processing at other Russian plants is impossible. In simple terms, if this mechanism fails, problems can arise far beyond a single enterprise. The geography of Ukrainian strikes is becoming increasingly impressive. If even a distance of 2,500 kilometers no longer guarantees the safety of strategic facilities, then there are fewer and fewer places in Russia where one can truly feel untouchable. And this is already a problem not just for a single plant, but for the entire system that relies on the uninterrupted production of fuel for the war. Meanwhile, the front is turning into a real nightmare for the occupiers. Ukrainian forces are reclaiming territory, Russian logistics are bursting at the seams under drone strikes, the occupiers' losses are breaking record after record, and the Black Sea, which was once considered the domain of the Russian fleet, is increasingly turning into a zone of constant fear for the Kremlin. So what is really happening at the front? Why has June become one of the toughest months for Putin's army? And how is Ukraine, step by step, taking away Russia's main military advantages? Let's break it down right now. While Russian propaganda paints yet another victory, the Ukrainian armed forces, quietly and without unnecessary noise, have caused a real collapse of the front for the occupiers. On one of the sectors. In just a month and a half, Ukrainian forces have regained control over dozens of square kilometers of territory that had been considered Russian rear for over a year. And most interestingly, this defeat is so painful, the Russians are trying to hide it at any cost. According to preliminary estimates, we are talking about at least 50 square kilometers of liberated land. And certain hints from analysts suggest that the numbers could be even higher. To put it into perspective, if this data is confirmed, Ukraine could, for the first time in a long while, achieve a positive balance of liberated territories in a single month. And this is already a serious signal to everyone who was quick to write off Ukraine's offensive potential. The enemy's reaction is especially telling. Throughout June, the Russian side published only a few videos from this direction. And even those videos actually showed not the occupiers' successes, but the advance of Ukrainian forces. When an army that usually films every meter of its advance suddenly goes silent, it often means only one thing. There's really nothing to report there. It seems that Ukrainian drones have turned part of the front into a real zone of terror for the occupiers. Russia was forced to bombard its own former positions with dozens of guided aerial bombs. trying to stop the advance of the Ukrainian armed forces. But even that didn't help. What was recently considered a Russian bridgehead is gradually coming under the control of Ukrainian forces. And there is another very important detail here. The offensive began with the use of armored vehicles, which, contrary to the predictions of many experts, are not outdated at all. Combined with the widespread use of drones, this allowed them to break through and minimize losses. In fact, Ukrainian forces are demonstrating a new formula for an offensive where drones not only assist the troops but actually pave the way for them through the most dangerous sections of the front. And that's not all. In just 1 month, Ukraine's defense forces struck more than 200,000 enemy targets. And behind each of these numbers are destroyed equipment, demolished depots, burned supply routes, disrupted logistics, and yet another blow to Russia's capabilities to continue the war. The most painful outcome for the occupiers. Nearly 28,000 Russian soldiers have been eliminated or sustained such severe injuries that they are out of action. In fact, June has become one of the most difficult months for the Russian army in recent times. And importantly, more and more often, Ukrainian strikes are reaching the enemy far beyond the front line, in places where they recently still felt relatively safe. The Minister of Defense reported that the number of targets hit at a distance of more than 50 kilometers from the line of contact has almost doubled. In other words, Ukrainian drones and precision strike weapons are penetrating deeper and deeper into the Russian rear. And this means that for the occupiers, the war no longer ends at the first line of defense. There is a particular focus on logistics. That is exactly where the most painful blows are being dealt today. It seems that Ukrainian UAV operators have launched a real hunt for anything moving toward the front line. Trucks, fuel tankers, motorcycles, ammunition depots. All of this is increasingly turning to smoke before it even reaches Russian positions. June became a record-breaking month for the defense forces. Ukrainian soldiers set a record for destroying Russian artillery. They showed the best results since the start of the full-scale war in intercepting enemy drones. Nearly 50,000 units, and they also set an absolute record for destroying the occupiers' vehicles and motorcycles. And most importantly, these are no longer just isolated successful operations, but a systematic campaign to exhaust the enemy. Day by day, Ukrainian drones are methodically tightening the noose around the occupiers' logistics. And it seems that this is exactly what they fear most in Moscow, because the front can be reinforced with new soldiers. But restoring a destroyed supply system under constant fire from Ukrainian drones is much more difficult. That is why June may turn out to be not just a record month, not just in terms of losses for Russia, but as the beginning of much more serious problems ahead. And while the armed forces of Ukraine are reclaiming their land meter by meter, it seems that in the Kremlin they've decided to take their favorite route, simply painting themselves a victory. After another series of successes by Ukrainian forces at the front, Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov suddenly started talking about the great achievements of the Russian army and the inevitable fulfillment of all the war's objectives. However, there is one problem. Reality once again forgot to coordinate its plans with Kremlin propaganda. While Russians were being told on the radio about a successful offensive, independent analysts took a close look at the maps that Russian generals showed to Putin. And it turned out that there's a gap of almost 2,000 square kilometers between the front lines and the Kremlin's reports. In other words, while the Ukrainian armed forces are liberating territories in the real world, the Russian general staff compensates for this by capturing territory in the world of fantasy. The funniest part is not even the scale of these fabrications, but their content. On the paper maps prepared for Putin, the Russian army has almost reached Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Supposedly they have full control over Chasiv Yar. They are advancing toward Dobropilya, and in some places they are almost approaching Zaporizhzhia. It seems that the Kremlin's master is being shown not battle reports, but a trailer for yet another science fiction movie. And it is precisely here that it becomes clear why Moscow speaks so confidently about its successes. If you look at maps every day where the army advances faster than common sense, you can start to believe any fairy tale. The only problem is that the real front exists outside the Kremlin offices. And there, Russian troops are increasingly encountering not drawn arrows, but Ukrainian drones, artillery, and counterattacks. But the most painful blow for the Kremlin, it seems, did not happen on land, but at sea. On Navy Day, Volodymyr Zelensky directly stated that Russia has lost the Black Sea. Just a few years ago, such a statement would have seemed like science fiction. A country without a large navy forced one of the world's biggest naval fleets to retreat. After the liberation of Zminy Island, a series of strikes on ships, headquarters, bases, and ports, the occupiers have effectively lost the ability to feel like masters of the waters. Today, the Black Sea has become yet another example of how Ukrainian technologies and unconventional solutions break Russian military patterns. Naval drones have accomplished what until recently was considered nearly impossible. They forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to shift from a show of strength to a mode of constant survival. And now Russian ships increasingly resemble not hunters but prey, constantly looking over their shoulders. It seems this is only the beginning of much bigger problems for Moscow. After all, if the Black Sea is no longer safe for Russian ships, then the Black Sea and Azov regions can no longer be considered a rear area. And while the Kremlin continues to boast about its successes, Ukraine is step by step taking away from the enemy what he considered his unquestionable advantage. It seems the Kremlin has once again decided to test how far they can go. The United States has warned Poland about possible Russian hybrid attack scenarios, the goal of which is not to seize territory, but to test. Is NATO ready to respond firmly if another so-called accidental incident suddenly crosses the alliance's border? And it seems that in Moscow, once again, they're looking for a way to play with fire without getting burned. The most interesting part is that this isn't about a classic invasion. According to Western media, the Kremlin is allegedly considering scenarios that have long become the trademark style of Russian policy. Drones over critical infrastructure, strange incidents at the border, mysterious airspace violations, or even the appearance of soldiers who, as usual, might just get lost. One of the most alarming possible developments is linked to the Polish-Belarusian border. According to this scenario, a local provocation involving military personnel could occur, which would then be explained away as technical malfunctions, navigational errors, or yet another rescue operation. The only problem is that after several years of war, such explanations are already met with distrust in Europe. It is particularly interesting that among the possible scenarios, there is also mention of an attempt to shift responsibility onto someone else. According to sources, in Moscow, they are allegedly even discussing the option of presenting the upcoming provocation as if Ukraine is behind it. The old principle remains unchanged. First create a problem and then explain that someone else is to blame. And although this is only about a possible scenario, the very fact of such warnings is very telling. It seems on the eastern flank, NATO is taking the risk more and more seriously that the Kremlin might try to test the alliance not with a major war, but with a series of small and well-calculated provocations. And while danger looms over Poland, it is preoccupied with scandals involving Ukraine. Western Ukraine is referred to by names from old Polish maps, EU accession is linked to Bandera, and in Krakow, a scandal erupts around the grave of a Ukrainian figure. Is this a series of coincidences, an election game by Polish politicians, or part of a much larger scenario whose authors are eager to drive a wedge between Kyiv and Warsaw? Right now? Let's break it down in this report. Is Poland really preparing to attack Ukraine? These are exactly the kinds of questions that started to arise after a loud statement from the office of the Polish president. There, Western Ukraine was suddenly referred to as Eastern Lesser Poland. Formally, it's a historical term, but in today's context, it sounded as if someone had pulled out a nearly century-old map from a dusty archive and decided to remind all of Europe about it. That is exactly how the official Polish authorities referred to these territories during the interwar period, when Lviv, Ternopil, and other cities were part of the Second Polish Republic. In other words, instead of modern geography, historical terminology with a very specific political undertone was used. And while some talk about unfortunate wording, others ask, why use a term at all that has sparked controversy for decades? Such rhetoric began to resemble Kremlin tactics, since Russia has for years promoted its own historical constructs like Novorossiya, trying to use them to justify its claims to foreign territories. Now, however, an uncomfortable question is being raised more and more often in the information space. Is Warsaw not opening Pandora's box where historical names suddenly begin to take on a political life of their own? Of course, there is no talk of any real Polish attack on Ukraine, but the very fact that such formulations have appeared at the official level has already become an informational bombshell, especially against the backdrop of disputes surrounding the Volyn tragedy, where emotions are already running high. And now, instead of a calm dialogue, there is once again a reason to argue about borders, history, and old grievances that, as it turns out, have not disappeared at all. But the surprises from our neighbor did not end there. On Ukraine's path to the European Union, it was not a new package of reforms, not economic demands, and not even Brussels bureaucracy that suddenly appeared. This time, according to Warsaw, the main obstacle was Stepan Bandera. Polish Deputy Prime Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz essentially stated that as long as Ukraine honors the figures of the OUN and UPA, the doors to the EU may remain closed. In Warsaw, it is increasingly being said that the issue of historical memory may turn out to be more important than geopolitics. The Polish Minister of Defense has directly warned that with Bandera, Ukraine will not join the European Union. And while Kyiv talks about reforms, defense, and integration, some Polish politicians seem to be moving the negotiations from Brussels to the archives of the 20th century. It's strange that such a dispute is unfolding precisely at a time when Ukraine is fighting the largest war in modern European history. Instead of discussing the continent's security, sanctions, or joint defense, the political agenda is suddenly overtaken by debates about figures from the past. It seems that some politicians are looking for answers to the challenges of 2026 in textbooks from the 1940s. Meanwhile, tensions are only rising. President Poczty has already made harsh statements about the cult of violence, and opposition leader Jarosław Kaczyński has even called for blocking new stages of Ukraine's EU accession talks. And now, more and more experts are asking whether the historical debate is turning into a political tool, one that allows certain forces to score points with the domestic audience. In Kyiv, the response was no less loud. Volodymyr Zelensky stated that no one will tell Ukrainians whom to consider their heroes and to whom they should be grateful. Thus, the conflict over the past is gradually turning into a fundamental dispute about the future. And the question is no longer just about how history is interpreted. The question is whether historical memory will become a new political border within Europe itself. While Poland and Ukraine argue about history, unknown individuals decided to add some vandalism into the mix. In Krakow, the grave of the famous Ukrainian writer Bohdan Lepki was damaged. A bronze bas-relief disappeared from the tombstone, and the incident immediately sparked a reaction on both sides of the border, especially because it happened at a time when Ukrainian-Polish relations are already going through yet another historical storm. In Kyiv, people immediately started talking about a provocation. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that such actions could be aimed at inciting hostility between the two nations. After all, the coincidence of circumstances looks far too suspicious. First, there were heated disputes over Volhynia, Bandera, and historical memory. And then, an act of vandalism at the grave of a person who had been a bridge between Ukrainian and Polish cultures all his life. But the most interesting statement came from the Polish police. They said that so far they do not see any signs of a national motive. Moreover, law enforcement officers suggest that the damage could have occurred at any time over the course of 2 weeks. In other words, while politicians, experts, and social media users are already constructing grand geopolitical theories, investigators remind us that it might simply be a banal case of metal theft or an ordinary act of vandalism. However, the timing of such an incident turned out to be just too convenient. Just the day before, Ukrainian and Polish services had warned about possible information provocations from Russia. In Warsaw, they spoke about increased activity from Russian bot farms, while in Kyiv, they reported preparations for new campaigns centered around sensitive historical issues. It seems that someone really wants Ukrainians and Poles to argue with each other again, instead of paying attention to the real source of the problems. Now, the main question is, who did this and why? Was it just an ordinary theft? Or was it a well-calculated provocation by the crazy neighbor? That will only become clear after the investigation. But no matter how hard they try to undermine relations between Kyiv and Warsaw, the most important thing has already been proven in recent years. Ukraine and Poland may argue about history, have different views on past events, and engage in difficult discussions. But that does not negate the strategic partnership that has formed in the face of common challenges. That is why every provocation, every act of vandalism, or every piece of disinformation today looks like an attempt to sow distrust, exactly where the enemies most want to see it. And it seems that despite all the disputes, it is much harder to set Ukrainians and Poles against each other than those who would benefit most from such a quarrel would like. Ukrainian drones have long since stopped flying at random. The American little bird whispers intelligence to Ukrainian operators. According to the Financial Times, American intelligence is helping Ukraine find the most convenient routes for strikes on Russian oil refineries, allowing drones to bypass the densest air defense zones. If previously Moscow explained fires at strategic sites as accidents, now it seems that someone is skillfully advising exactly where to fly and what is best to avoid. The results have turned out to be extremely unpleasant for the Kremlin. Since the beginning of the year alone, Ukrainian long-range drones have carried out nearly 200 successful strikes on Russian oil refineries. This is several times more than last year. For years, the Kremlin built a multi-layered defense system around strategic enterprises. But now, Ukrainian drones are increasingly reaching exactly those places where, according to any Russian scenario, they were never supposed to get. And while the Russian Ministry of Defense reports thousands of supposedly downed targets, new black spots keep appearing on the country's map, from fires at fuel infrastructure facilities. Not only oil refineries come under fire, but also fuel depots, logistics hubs, tank farms, and enterprises that keep the military machine running. In other words, Ukrainian drones are increasingly targeting not just individual facilities, but the entire supply system that sustains the Russian army. While the Kremlin continues to paint itself victories and waits for a convenient moment for another ultimatum, signals have come from the United States that could be a real cold shower for Putin. In Washington, there is increasingly louder talk about strengthening Ukraine's defense capabilities, new formats of military support, and even steps that until recently seemed absolutely impossible. Moreover, American officials are now openly assessing the real state of the Russian army. And these assessments are unlikely to please the Kremlin. So it seems that the main blow to Moscow's plans may come not from the battlefield, but from across the Atlantic. Recently, more and more unpleasant surprises have been piling up for Putin. Details in the report. America's formidable fist has struck Putin. The Kremlin has started to catch on. Their hopes for Trump may fall apart faster than Russian promises to take Ukraine in 3 days. After another phone conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, people in Moscow suddenly started talking as if they had lost their last diplomatic lifeline. The hysteria in the Russian information space is only gaining momentum. But the most interesting things are happening behind the scenes. Russian commentators and Kremlin-affiliated experts are increasingly openly complaining that Trump may turn out to be nothing like the ally they were counting on. Russian circles already understand that after the NATO summit, Washington is shifting to a much tougher stance toward Moscow. For years, Russian propaganda has been convincing its audience that as soon as the occupant of the White House changes, the West will immediately start taking the Kremlin's interests into account. But now, a completely different opinion is being voiced more and more often in Moscow. It seems that Washington is beginning to lose patience with the endless Kremlin ultimatums and attempts to prolong the war. That is why the nervousness in Moscow is becoming increasingly noticeable. Because if even in the US there is increasingly louder talk about the need to put pressure on Russia, and the expected understanding with Washington still does not happen, then the Kremlin faces a very unpleasant prospect. It turns out that Ukraine may not be Putin's only main problem, not just at the front, but also the fact that his diplomatic game is starting to fall apart simultaneously on all fronts. And it seems that the Kremlin has fewer and fewer reasons for optimism. At the NATO summit in Turkey, one of the main topics in the negotiations between Trump and Zelensky is ending the war. And this is a very telling signal. While Moscow continues to repeat its old ultimatums, Washington is increasingly actively searching for a peace formula together with Kyiv. Ukraine's role in international negotiations is only growing stronger, while the Kremlin is gradually losing the ability to impose its own agenda for the day. Moreover, Washington is announcing new defense agreements worth billions of dollars and calling on its allies to increase military spending. In other words, while the Kremlin dreams of Western fatigue, the alliance is discussing new ways to strengthen its own defense and support its partners. And if this trend continues, truly dangerous times are coming for Putin. Because while the Kremlin still lives with memories of how it used to negotiate with the West in the language of blackmail and threats, in Washington they are increasingly talking about ending the war from a position of strength. And then it may turn out that the main blow to the Kremlin's plans came not from the front, but from NATO's negotiating rooms, where Russia is increasingly seen less as a player capable of dictating the rules. But even that is not all. In the US, they have started talking about a move that Moscow considered absolutely impossible just a few years ago. Donald Trump has allowed for the possibility of granting licenses to produce American weapons not only in Europe, but also directly in Ukraine. And if this decision is implemented, it could become a real nightmare for Russian strategists. In fact, we are talking about a scenario in which Ukraine would gradually receive not only finished weapons, but also the ability to produce some of the most important systems on its own. This is especially important in the context of Russia's constant ballistic missile attacks, since one of the main objectives is to increase the production of interceptor missiles for air defense systems. Trump himself confirmed that such an idea is indeed under consideration.
They would like to do this. We will consider this issue. Even more
interesting was Germany's position. Chancellor Friedrich Merz essentially acknowledged what the military has been saying for a long time. The current level of arms production in the West is insufficient.
We are all facing the problem that we are currently producing too little. This can be compensated for by granting licenses to companies that have the necessary production capacities. Among them are both European and Ukrainian companies.
For the Kremlin, there is a particularly unpleasant detail here. The Russian strategy was largely based on the assumption that Ukraine would be dependent on external supplies, and any delays in aid would automatically weaken the defense. But if American technologies start being produced closer to the front and part of the weaponry is manufactured in Ukraine, this logic begins to fall apart right before our eyes. Volodymyr Zelensky also openly speaks about the importance of such a decision. In
The United States production is not as large as our needs. We need licenses. When President Trump is positive, I hope that means yes.
If this plan gets the green light, it could be a much more painful blow to Moscow than another aid package. Because missiles run out, warehouses are emptied, but established production works for years. And then Russia will have to deal not just with deliveries of Western weapons, but with Ukraine's constantly growing defense potential, which will become increasingly difficult to stop even with all the Kremlin's resources. And in the meantime, J.D. Vance is pouring oil on the fire. He stated that Russia's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations has now become negligible and is in fact approaching zero. And this sounds especially painful for a country that, for the 5th year in a row, has been trying to convince the world of its inexhaustible military might. According to Vance, Ukraine's strategy of exhausting the enemy has begun to yield results. While the Russian army tries to claw out a few more kilometers at the front, it is paying an ever higher price for it. And today, the Kremlin's main achievements are not captured territories, but record numbers of lost equipment and personnel. Washington has effectively acknowledged that Russia has fallen into its own trap. Each new assault cost the occupiers so much that even their nominal advances look less and less like military success. A paradoxical situation is emerging. The map may shift by a few hundred meters, but the losses are counted in the thousands of people. And if these assessments are correct, then this is truly a worrying signal for the Kremlin. Because when even Washington says that Russia's offensive capabilities are almost exhausted, it means only one thing. Despite all the loud statements and the maps drawn for Putin, the real situation at the front is less and less. It resembles the story of the Russian offensive. And more, it resembles the story of the slow exhaustion of an army that is no longer able to achieve its goals. And what do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, leave a like, and subscribe so you don't miss the main news. See you in the next episode.